It was another Monday morning. The sign on the door said private investigator, but the sign below that said closed, and I was saying yes to a third cup of coffee. It was a bitter, heavy roast, like an SEC lawsuit. My partner was out of town, looking into a band's kidnapped drummer, but that was like debugging a bad buffer overflow, too many symbols and on the wrong count. When a file path walked in. I have a stalker, they said, handing me a stack of letters. Most were ambiguous, but their intent was clear. Each one ended with a slash. I get these at home, they continued. Outside home, they follow me everywhere. I looked at more letters. Nothing about them was normal. I want you to get to the root of this, they demanded. I can, I said, but not for free. Some of them are encoded, but 2E or not 2E, I charge by the hour. They dropped some cash on my desk, then put a stop to this, period. Which means, this week, in a sponsored interview with Imperva, we chat with Karl Triebes about what 2023 brought to AppSec and what AppSec teams can bring to 2024. In the news segment, a fuzzing handbook, 2 strategies for open source security, 1 worm from 35 years ago, 117, John, what are you doing? We'll get to that and more. Follow the path and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. AI, accelerated cloud adoption, and hybrid work are fundamentally shifting how business gets done. The old way of securing your people, apps, and data doesn't work and scale anymore. To stay ahead, today's organizations need to reimagine their security and networking infrastructure with a cloud-first, unified SASE architecture. Join Palo Alto Networks and leading technologists from across the globe for SASE Converge 2023, a 2-day virtual experience, November 15th through 16th, revealing how SASE, powered by advanced AI, can drive better security and networking outcomes. Register today at securityweekly.com/Palo Alto. Come on, kitty. This is episode 263, recorded November 13th, 2023. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Good morning. I'm happy to talk more about those 117 when we get to it.
Yeah, we've only got half an hour, just saying, but we'll get to that. The other thing we're always looking for, however, is more guests, great guests for all of our Security Weekly shows. Submit your suggestions by completing the form at securityweekly.com/guests. For over 3 decades, Karl Triebes has helped conceive and build products, services, and businesses for networking, application software, storage, and cloud. At Imperva, he leads product management for the Application Security Business Unit, driving product innovation for customers. Prior, he was Executive VP of Product Development and CTO at F5. He has also held senior leadership positions with AWS, Foundry Networks, and Alcatel. Hello, Karl. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, good morning, guys. Great to be here.
We're happy to have you here. We had you back in middle of September talking about business logic, and I think we're going to expand from that, as business logic was one of the attacks that we've seen continually throughout the decade, perhaps, but at least throughout 2023. But one of the themes I think that you wanted to bring to us this time was that what did 2023 look like? And I'm curious from your perspective, did we see something new and interesting in AppSec attacks, or same old, or maybe some sort of mix and some other fourth thing that we can think about? Let us know.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I think one of the big things this year has just been kind of the rise of the bots. We've seen big increases over last year in bot traffic, but what we really saw was the proportion of these bad bots, basically that could be classified as advanced, very sophisticated bots that are very evasive, roughly doubled and represented half of all the bad bot traffic out there. So that was a huge increase. And one of the questions is, so what's going on here? What's driving this? Well, these bot armies are what are being enlisted to what we talked about prior. First of all, one, to exploit, business logic or flaws in the business logic, but they're being used all over the place for other types of attacks. Everything from being able to scrape data off of websites, which is kind of an example of where there's a big hack last year this year with Duolingo. And that all started out with a web scraping of an exposed API, to doing things like credential stuffing, like the 23andMe attack was a good example of that. So the bots are becoming kind of that underlying mechanism, and the sophistication of those bots are allowing these attackers to penetrate these apps much more easily than they could in the past.
And those bots seem to be doing, the examples you just gave us, none of that was misusing the application, misusing the API. But I think all of them would be an example of valid input. There's no like weird strings in there that look like a OWASP top 10 sort of payload, that type of thing. So, what I'm pointing out there is that this is just abuse, misuse that's just getting larger in scale. I'm curious, and I want to get this perhaps out of the way because one of the other things we've been talking about in 2023 is AI. So generative AI, LLMs, are these creating the rise of the bots? Are these making the bots worse? Or is this, how should we be thinking of that, at least so far?
Yeah, it's been hard to attribute specific, instances of AI being leveraged. But if you just look at the data, it suggests, just based on the sophistication and the rise of these attacks, these advanced bots, that generative AI is being used. And some of the recent releases from ChatGPT, for example, where now it can be used to effectuate, outbound commands and things like that. You have to expect that it's going to be leveraged in some fashion to continue to increase that sophistication, because now bots can learn a lot faster. I was thinking about this earlier today, actually, just about command and control networks for bots. And typically in the past, it's been about imperative decrees, right, where you get in there and you have to have a very explicit list of things for them to do and look for. And if they don't find that, then you go back and you have to recode and do things like that. Well, I think it's going to look a lot more declarative, just like you see with Kubernetes. Where basically they're looking for an end state more, and that the bot has whoever's basically in this command and control network managing these bots then has the intelligence to go and augment the commands and the structures to get to that outcome. And I think that's what we're going to see. And what that means, again, it goes back to having much more sophisticated bots that then are able to more quickly take advantage of either A, weaknesses in the applications, B, known like exploits or vulnerabilities within applications, or C, be able to overwhelm, and do things like denial of service attacks, things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think what you're describing, how I heard it about the AI helping is it's helping developers with problems that they have in front of them. And yes, bot networks, malware, ransomware, et cetera, they do have developers, they have Jira tickets, they have customer support, just like our DevOps teams do. So perhaps that is that generative AI LLMs are helping just some tedium, I guess, maybe is what I'm trying to tease out, where they're helping or how they're helping developers.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great question. I mean, one of the things that we've seen to date, a lot of usage of LLMs has been in basically better understanding events and data, meaning that they're able to create more, like today, for example, we throw off a lot of events here at Imperva, within our system at various levels. We see a lot of things and you trigger a bunch of events. But what's challenging then for users is to look at those events and be able to kind of triangulate on maybe what's happening. And so the obvious thing to use LLM models for is to look at that event data and then be able to help provide that narrative around, okay, what are we seeing out there? What should you be thinking about? And what are the appropriate next steps to be done? And that's exactly what we're doing with it. We're also using it, obviously, to help with documentation. So a lot of it's around that whole thing around education. We use it quite a bit to help detect certain types of attacks or to enhance our machine learning. That's a bit of an arms race, that you have to maintain because the attackers are going to be doing it. You have to do it, and your models have to be better than theirs, and be able to suss out these behaviors. And that's absolutely something that's a big focus for us going into 2024. Is how do we better suss out those bad actors and the behaviors associated with that that are backed by these AI models. But again, I still think it's early days. I think it's very early days.
And I do love the mention of just the machine learning aspect too, because that predated all of the fun of the LLMs and LLM poisoning. We've had machine learning for a long time. As you're pointing out, it's a language model race. Another aspect you also mentioned was the education. And I want to come back to that for a second because 2023, we also saw some MOVEit. Like that was a big attack. It was getting exploited a lot. Looking into it was SQL injection, looking at the exploit code for it. I was looking at some Python code for it. Mm-hmm. It's basic SQL injection. It's just like frustrating. can we not have LLM just go and rewrite some, find the SQL injection for us or rewrite the code to be more secure? Why are we running into this? I ask in the great rhetorical question.
Yeah, Move It was disastrous kind of vulnerability, and it was interesting all at the same time because you're right, it was a basic SQL injection, but it was attacking a file server, and all web application firewalls, if not most, can generally see these types of problems, right? They can see a SQL injection and they'll block that or alert on it. But often they didn't have typical or traditional web application or firewalls, web application firewalls sitting in front of these devices. And there wasn't a lot of great hygiene around like port management and things like that in many cases, right? Because, hey, it's over HTTP or, STTP. I think it was, HTTP, and there's some other ways to access it, if I recall. But so the cases we saw they weren't customers of ours. They're actually organizations. They were suddenly, they're actually suddenly suffering breaches because the attackers got in before they were able to patch. And that's the big problem. And so, if they had them sitting behind the web app firewalls, they would have been fine. Or some other, more advanced security thing. So I think we're just going to find more examples of that because you can think about it. Move It was a great example of a very legacy application, very useful, but very legacy. And many organizations have all sorts of these legacy apps running around, and it just takes someone to figure out a vulnerability and come in and take advantage of that. And so that's a great example of that. And there's a whole bunch of probably things that come out of this, everything from good patching hygiene, to ensuring that you have consistent policies in front of all of your attached devices.
Yeah, and I think for me, if I put my 2024 wishing hat on, it would also be just like with Move It, file transfer. Let's rewrite this, I say easily, into WebAssembly, like the WebAssembly I/O capabilities. Those aren't quite in place yet, but it's going to support file system semantics, HTTP connections, and rewriting something that's not a SQL backed file transfer protocol over HTTPS into WebAssembly seems so much better just in terms of what the potential consequences could be of a compromise.
Yeah, getting it out of the domain of JavaScript is a good thing in general. But with WebAssembly, don't you think that it just opens up all new, basically, Pandora's boxes when you can you can compile in any code source, right? Hey, I can run C, I can run this, I can run that. It just seems like now you're opening up that landscape for different types of applications. So you get that flexibility and you solve one problem, but who knows what you're opening up. With these other issues of just opening, basically making it, hey, I can run any language. You know what I mean? So hygiene and other things, or the opportunity to abuse that's going to run rampant. And it's like what we see. You look at APIs today. That it's such a wild west. I think we'll see it there as well.
Yeah, I think for me, I like the idea of like WebAssembly because we can talk about getting rid of a class of vulnerabilities, perhaps, with the sandboxing, so that it's not you can't escape it into unless there's an actual implementation error, but well designed, without vulns in the WebAssembly engine. You're not doing path traversals, one of my favorite vulns, throughout the underlying operating system. You're not having a SQL injection because for whatever reason you have SQL injection in a modern app. And that's where I'm thinking in the sense of, we talk about like even with memory safe languages, Go, Rust, et cetera. Yes, we're still going to have a directory traversal, for example. We've had examples of that. We can still have other vulns, but I do love at least getting rid of one class. Another class of vulns, which is perhaps unrelated to WebAssembly directly, but that we've seen attacks through this year, is MFA and how MFA has or hasn't, for that matter, been adopted. And I'm curious, how you see this working into both the API abuse, the bot traffic, as well as just the developers building these systems.
Yeah, I mean, most of what we see on APIs is account takeover type attacks, and there's multiple ways the attackers get in there. Right? They do anything from like credential stuffing, for example, where they're going off a targeted list of known exploited or basically data that's been stolen, right? And so they take that and then they'll find, account names and passwords, and they'll go through that. Now, MFA does help, obviously, because it creates another validation, but there's ways to get around that as well. It depends on if they can find flaws within the application. My screen went into screen saving mode, so just follow it. I guess I have to use that more. Anyway, there's ways to get around that as well, and usually it's through like flaws in the application. So, for example, through APIs, there's often ways to find flaws in that. In fact, APIs typically don't use any kind of two-factor authentication, right, or multi-factor authentication. You come in, you're getting validated, you get validated with a token. That session, once you're in, you're in. And then there's nothing really looking at your behaviors unless you have some sort of API firewall that's sitting behind it that's able to detect, hey, is this first of all, one, is this user behaving the way you would expect them to use, or they're accessing objects or data within the application that they shouldn't be accessing. That's probably the biggest thing. And so that's just, APIs are just becoming more that Wild West of access, that have trouble with that multi-factor authentication. But going back to regular applications, there's ways to social engineer around these things. You hear about them all the time. You can keep, for example, you don't want to use a multi-factor authentication with, I would say, just using a standard cell phone. You want to use, what I mean that is don't use it over text. Use a application that can manage that, because it's easier to spoof, SMS than it is, like a Google Authenticator or some other application, and that definitely helps. But at the end of the day, the app or the credential system actually has to manage that. And I just think about Okta, for example. Here's the world's leading identity provider, and they get hacked in a bad way. And not just once, they've been hacked several times. So the question starts becoming, all right, well, maybe that wasn't, of course, we don't know the full anatomy of that attack, but identity is key, but it only can provide so much coverage.
Yeah, I think, and that's where it's talking about who is your customer support, what data do they have access to, and in one of the examples was, here's a HAR file that just so happens to have session cookies that already have gone through an MFA challenge perhaps, and can get reused against an API. And these are a couple of those surprising areas that some of their clients were discovering and figuring out, how do we also protect ourselves from such a thing. So I'm curious then, one of the other questions I want to bring here is that, looking back on 2023 with, the MFA or API access, things that we've just been talking about, and others, what's a behavior that AppSec teams or DevOps teams could or should adopt in reaction to this? What can they do perhaps for their own systems first, their own software?
Yeah, I think in terms of their own software and managing that, well, obviously good hygiene, good developer hygiene, especially on your API side. Ensuring you're conforming, have a set of standards that you conform to, validate those standards, and before you put any APIs in production. So that's one key aspect of that. The other hygiene is just CVE management. You know what I mean? So quickly patch any known exploits. That includes any open source that you're using as your backend application, but also any other more broad applications that you're using. That's the other key thing. The other thing is just active user management. Just ensure that your Active Directory or your authentication systems are up to date. And it's tested regularly. There's a whole bunch of, and this is all standard stuff. I think they call it, when you look at, when you're trying to go and get, let's say here, cybersecurity insurance for your company, they call it the dirty dozen, and there's 12 things that you have to have in place to support that. And so it's all generally around good hygienic practices like that, having an EDR, authentication system, multi-factor. There's a whole bunch of things that go into that. But there's many things you need to do on top of that, because that just speaks to the bare minimums, and it doesn't necessarily speak to the specifics of your business or your applications or what you're trying to accomplish there. And then that's where it goes into these application protections.
That's what's interesting. I think that it's one thing just to say, here are the dirty dozen. Here's here are the group that's come to say the same thing that probably you could have rattled off last year, the year before, perhaps even the decade before, and they're not. But these are general. So I'm curious then, is there a different emphasis perhaps in 2024 or a way to say maybe, as we did back in September, sort of unpack what that business logic is, or here is something that is specific to my organization, but trying to figure out how to make that universal as a guidance for end users.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I mentioned earlier, over half of the traffic on the internet right now is automated, and that was about a five. We saw about a 5% increase overall on that traffic, and it's going to continue to go up. We see it year over year going up, and so relative, so if you look at the number of bad bots, 30% of overall internet traffic is bad bots. There's good and bad out there. The bad bots are out there to do bad things. And I don't know how many customer websites I look at where bot activity is happening and they have no idea that it's happening. And they won't know until you show them. They seem blasé about it because nothing bad has happened in their case. But it's one of those things where it's not, it's not a problem until it's a problem. And eventually they're going to get through it because they're continually just beating on your website or your application to try to find a way in. And so you need to reduce that attack surface because, like I said earlier, these bots are getting more sophisticated and they're just getting better and faster at what they do. And so you need a strategy around that. So you really either need you need to be watching them or you need to be blocking them and reducing that attack surface. The other thing that I would say is that APIs, as I was mentioning earlier, have become kind of that new place where attackers are entering because, again, you can automate these attacks and very rapidly, basically pummel your site through these APIs. And it's much harder to watch that because these APIs are constantly changing at many organizations. So they don't always, so you need a tool that's kind of mapping it out and ensuring that the data that's being transacted is valid, new endpoints aren't showing up that shouldn't show up, and that they're not able to take advantage of issues or flaws within the business logic and things like that. And so those are definitely areas to focus on in 2024 because that's where the money's coming from, for these attackers. And, I think it's interesting is that, like, for example, you're seeing new exploits showing up like on things like connected car networks. There was, who was it? I think it was Sam Curry found a bunch of vulnerabilities on various APIs that are part of the smart car networks where they can honk horns and do other things. And, you can just think about as cars become more automated and sophisticated, what kind of problems can that, cause? I'd hate to see my Tesla with full self-driving. I hate to see it drive off without me at some point, So anyway, so there's things like that you got to think about. And I think APIs and bots are kind of key areas to be thinking about when you're thinking about application protections next year.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll add too, because bringing in the car API hacking, a lot of the underlying theme there was authentication and authorization as well within the CAN bus, within these interconnected devices, within the car itself, or that API access into it. So I guess there is that theme of I love beating the drum of FIDO keys, WebAuthn, et cetera, for our humans, but it seems like for our machine users, we still haven't figured out what are the short-lived tokens, what are the good patterns to implement here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a car can be, if you look at like a Land Rover right now, it has 42 computers in it. They're all talking to each other on these CAN buses. In fact, I saw a video not too long ago, I think it was a TikTok, where these thieves actually stole an Audi because they took off the headlight, hacked the CAN bus, and they were in like spade, they were in. And so so it goes back to your point about authentication, these mini mobile networks. And I think, to be honest, a lot of, application are running in networks that look the same way, that once you're in, that authentication is not being observed necessarily. It's like, okay, well, we have a session token, we're in, now what do I do? And that's where we get back to like behavioral mechanisms. That's where we get to kind of tracking user histories and looking at, what are they doing? Hey, suddenly are they accessing a file that they wouldn't normally access? Or are they trying to, reach endpoints within, things like that? That's going to become much more important as we go forward.
I'm curious if when you're talking with developers, organizations, there's a theme here that I hear in the sense of just what's going on with my app. And part of that is, you mentioned a while ago too, the bot traffic doesn't become a problem until it's a problem, but often that traffic isn't necessarily just a DOS. That's the obvious version. It's not just a scanner looking for known vulns, the cross-site scripting, SQL injection, blah, 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 the boring things. Yeah. It's the going after Taylor Swift tickets or whatever Ticketmaster tickets they want. It's abusing and misusing the workflows that are already there. And I'm setting that up for the question of how much of logging has been appreciated within the app itself by the developers, or are they sort of, I'll make fun of the AppSec industry, are they shifting left the responsibility of logging onto external tools or other tools that the developers won't want to build into the apps themselves?
Yeah, I think it's more the dichotomy between developer and security, security person, if you will, a security personnel, because the developer is looking at like debugging, right? That's, I'm a developer by trade. And so what I cared about were all the stats that I needed to figure out, I got a memory leak. What do I do about that? And I build the whatever mechanisms I need around that. Or, I got some other problem. Hey, this, some data issue, whatever. So I'm building stats for that. But those aren't necessarily useful or easy for others to use. And that's the question is, it's kind of like, writing a book. You got to know your audience. And it's the same thing, I think, with events and stats and things like that. You got to know the audience in order for it to be useful. And so I think part of the problem is that you have developers that worry about theirs, like, I got, basically I got a core dump. So they have all the stats they need to go deal with that and figure out what caused that. But they're not going to care necessarily if something came in and accessed a file that shouldn't have accessed that file. That falls back into the domain of the security teams. The security teams then, are relying heavily on SIMs, and applications written in SIMs to kind of suss out these behaviors. And a lot of times they go into event overload. And it's really hard then, to see that. In fact, a lot of attacks that happen today tend to be these obfuscation attacks. They'll come in and DOS a system to make a lot of noise, and then they'll sneak in some other way. And then that's the real exploit. They're trying to exfiltrate that data. So there is a bit of a gap there. And that's part of what I was saying about the leveraging AI, was that the ability to now take a lot of these events and better craft narratives around what's happening and suss out, the signal from the noise.
Yeah, I like that idea that give the tedium, give the AI a task to say, go find this metaphorical needle in our haystack, or this whatever is swimming around in our data lake. That could be much more helpful. So that's one aspect that I see that maybe 2024 will bring for AppSec. There was another angle there. Maybe I even want to roll back to the idea of design, because you've been mentioning too, why is someone accessing this file? Why is someone accessing this particular system, or, using their access to pivot to something else? I mentioned WebAssembly and sandboxing. Have you seen attempts to go back and re-architect an application once it's been built? I kind of guessed what the answer already is going to be, because that seems really hard to figure out. Hey, we can do all of this expansive pivot, movement. How do we block that from something that's already built?
It's really tough to go back and just re-architect. If it's not built, things that of that nature, have to usually be thought out, at the time the app is being architected, because it's usually fairly fundamental. And so I don't know, it's a little bit like when you go back and try to do something, it's a little bit like trying to get the flour out of the bread after it's already been baked. It's just, you just usually have to start over, is what I've seen. So it's usually a complete re-architecture, or it's a major redo that's expensive. And so many organizations don't want to take that on, because it's time, money, and, it may take years for it to pay off. And so now, hygienically, that's the right thing to do, but it's often hard to have that long-term view of what should be done.
Yeah, and I think that's a very, very honest and fair response to my over-optimistic question. But maybe as a follow-up, do we, as the AppSec industry, or even providing developers with tools, do we have the components perhaps to build that effective isolation? And here I'm thinking of application layer encryption. I'm thinking of, the better short-lived tokens for authentication, authorization that we were talking about before. Other ways of logical separation, rather than just an old school, we need this moat around this castle, and this other old type of metaphor that worked that maybe never even worked back in the 2000s when everybody was making slides like that.
Yeah, I absolutely. There's absolutely things that can be done that improve that posture. No doubt. And I thought what you're referring to earlier was just the application itself enforcing these things.
Oh, fair point.
Yeah. And so, but going back, you're absolutely right. You can do things like, encrypting. Well, everything should be encrypted anyways, but how you manage the keys, how you do the short-term tokens. If you look at, like, for example, Google now wants to do much faster key rotation, for SSL, for example, for TLS connections, things like that. So it's going to be harder than to spoof that. I mean, you're just making it harder, I think, is the way to think about it. And there's lots of ways to do it. So I think there's both things. So again, it's that kind of hygiene around just making it harder based on existing protocols and methods and improving those. But then also using detection mechanisms that can detect these behaviors at a much lower level in the system, like I was calling out, and say, for example, with APIs. APIs are, like I said, anything can happen there. They change, they're developer oriented. And as such, that makes them, much more harder to control. But if you have ways to kind of track the users, their behaviors, things like that, then those mechanisms become useful in conjunction with the good hygienic, things that need to happen to ensure that security. So.
And maybe that's an aspect too. I want to bring back to the idea of, like, you mentioned, like, with MoveIt, legacy type of software, SQL injection vuln, legacy type of attack, I'll say, put a WAF in front of it. Those are relatively common, easy patterns to detect, those types of payloads. API gateways, is this an area that developers can invest in more of, and are meaning putting, like, a lot of that authentication, authorization, responsibility into that API gateway? So we are building the hard layers around our perhaps crunchy APIs. And here I'm just trying to tease out, like, design patterns or where perhaps to invest in or think about for 2024 for an AppSec or developer team.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, there can be things that are, stronger, management of, like, individual objects. BOLA is one of the biggest exploits, right, in terms of for APIs, and so that's effectively where the objects aren't being properly managed, and so you have to take it down to the object level in terms of using identity, and that should happen within the application itself, and that should be conveyed with the identity through the gateway. And so, yeah, that's absolutely one case. But going back to MoveIt, I think what's the old saying is that if the app seems to have low vulnerabilities, probably nobody's looking. And I think MoveIt, MoveIt's a prime example of that one. It's been around forever, and this thing was living in it, and so somebody finally looked, and there it was. There's probably tons of these old applications out there that have that same condition. How many things do we keep finding in Java, for example? So it's you got to keep focus on your legacy applications and make sure that they are being managed as you're managing your other more mission critical ones. You shouldn't be complacent, I guess is what I'm saying on these things. And so I think it's having that full inventory and then being very active and looking at that inventory and saying, this is an old app. I really should have a strategy to start phasing these older legacy apps out over time, because they are probably more open to these types of exploits, and we're going to see more of these. I think as we go back to the AI, it's going to get smarter about quickly being able to figure it out and go in there and then take advantage of those flaws.
I'm going to squeeze in one question here at the end, sort of related to that. One of the topics we've had this year, Karl, is seeing development teams really sort of taking over the security AppSec. Instead of having security pushed down on them, you shall do, it's more that they're controlling the budget and running with it. From the API gateway point of view, have you seen anything around that? Are the developers starting to write those rules that they're putting on there, or how are they interacting with that device, whether it's a device or sort of a concept versus working with security?
It's still pretty early days. I mean, what I see from most organizations, they're just trying to get their hands around what APIs are actually being exposed from their organization. So the first thing is they're doing is discovery. And in many cases, they're shocked at how many APIs or what their APIs are actually conveying right now. So that's the first thing is, they're trying to get the inventory of that. And then the second is that they're not necessarily trying to find ways to put new onerous, requirements on the organization, but they are trying to find ways to get conformance. And so for the developers, that is creating essentially templates or essentially ways for them to validate against a framework that if they deviate from that, like, for example, they expose an endpoint that they shouldn't be, that it's caught before things go into production. So again, it's having those tools that allow kind of them to manage this within their pipelines and during test before it actually goes into production. And those are kind of the early phases. Now we're beginning to see then the next layer is where they're very interested in these detections, and that's where like being able to detect bull and these other types of exploits, because even good hygiene, it's very hard to suss out these business logic vulnerabilities and things like that. So in any case, so they're learning. I guess they're getting up to speed on that, these organizations, but it's still very early days in many cases.
And I like that theme of visibility into the app of just what is, and it's not visibility into attack traffic in the sense of, like I was saying, like all these input validation based types of attacks. It sounds like it's visibility into what is the API presenting? What are the objects that the API is delivering, which I think ties into that theme of business logic we talked about before, and it's what you built. And that to me just feels more appealing and more interesting in terms of an AppSec team delivering value of having that conversation with developers. So I really like that focus.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about that visibility at first, because the apps are very complex often. And so, being able to suddenly throwing, mechanisms that try to block these behaviors before you really have a handle on if they're valid or not, that's going to affect the business. And so the biggest sin of an app security product is that it becomes so either, false positive ridden, or it's so hard to manage, it starts blocking, the business. The business is just going to override it and say, no, we're not going to do that. So yeah, you have to fit within that, and I think that's what's critical.
Yeah. Now, Karl, you've been with us a couple times. Where as we wrap up these episodes, we ask for a description of AppSec in 3 words. And you already mentioned perhaps nobody's looking, which I might steal related to like Move It and those types of old school legacy vulns. But since I already stole that one from you, I'm curious if has your thinking changed over the year as you've seen more of these vulns?
Yeah, last time we talked on this, I think I said there's 3. You said 3 words. I said 3 words. Visibility, availability, and protection. And I think the first 2 still apply. Visibility is critical. Availability, like I said, if the business isn't up, then the app isn't. If your app isn't up, then the business isn't up. So you're blocking revenue. So, but the final one, I would say, protection is kind of an obvious thing. I think it's more about proactivity. That is being proactive in looking for vulnerabilities or issues in your systems. Look at your data, what it's telling you, and think about that. Like I said, with bots, for example, bots are out there. They're attacking pretty much every site out there. If you haven't seen it, it means you're not looking. And so you need to be proactive and take that and up front and take care of these threats before they become problems for you. So visibility, availability, and proactivity.
I love it. And hopefully some proactivity messages that you have shared with us this episode will help people go into 2024 with a little bit better application security. So thank you for that, Karl.
You bet.
Want to thank Karl once again for yet another fun conversation. Want to thank John and thank everybody for listening. To learn more about Imperva, visit securityweekly.com/Imperva. We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week.